So I am going to talk about extending Xcode 8, but before you start preparing your pillows to fall asleep, I promise you there will be no source code in this talk, which is kind of an unusual thing to promise for a technical talk, but I just thought I'd take a different tack and talk more conceptually about Xcode extensions. Kind of bring you up to date with what they are, if you haven't been paying attention, what they can do, and then although I won't share any source code on stage, I will link you to some source code that I have on GitHub at the end of the talk. So I'm going to sort of adapt an old cliche, a good developer is only as good as their tools. And I think many of us feel this way, especially when our tools are working for us. And we maybe even feel that way doubly so when our tools are not working for us. But we're always trying to push the limit. We're always trying to see what else we can do. What can we get out of these tools? And we get great tools from Apple as Apple, Mac and iOS developers, but I don't think any one of us is satisfied with them. So there's been a tradition of plugins, extensions, custom tools, custom compilers, sometimes even preprocessors, whatever, you name it, there's something out there. And finally, as of this past summer at WWDC, Apple is officially on board as well with Xcode source editor extensions. And I want to talk a little bit about what they are so that we're on the same page going forward. They're not here yet. They're coming in Xcode 8, and they are fairly limited. They are named appropriately source editor extensions because they only affect the source editor in Xcode. But on the other hand, they are the only Apple-supported mechanism for kind of general-purpose plugins for Xcode. So if you're interested in extending Xcode, this is what we have to work with for now. Now, I want to get some bad news out of the way. Unfortunately, how many people here use Alcatraz? You don't anymore. As of Xcode 8, you will not be using Alcatraz because Apple has added Xcode to the system integrity protection list, which prevents all manner of things, including debugging attaching to it and debugging the app and injecting code into the app. So, that basically means the mechanism for loading plugins that was sort of informally supported over many, many years is not going to be there in Xcode 8. The other bad news is that the scope of these extensions is pretty limited. You can't do much outside of, like I said, the source editor. And then another kind of bad news, depending on how you look at it, is you have to have an app carry this extension to your customers. So you think of a plugin or an extension, I think historically at least, we think of, especially definitely before the iPhone, we think of those as being kind of standalone things you can drag around and pop into a special directory, and then it magically augments an app's behavior. And these are, you're going to have to build a Mac app to go with whatever extension you ship for Xcode. Now, some good news. Again, I would like to just sort of appreciate that these are Apple approved. That means the likelihood of them stopping suddenly to work completely overnight, the way actually every Alcatraz plugin does whenever Apple updates Xcode, is greatly diminished. It's a good sign that Apple sees that there's a need for extending their tools. It's kind of a way that Apple's been evolving a little bit, I think, over the past several years to indulge developers that they haven't provided us everything we need and to give us, approved ways of doing more interesting things. And of course, Apple's focus on security and stability has become famous, especially the security stuff. And there have been a few scares over the past few years about plugins in Xcode and whether they might maliciously alter your app, whether they might ship with it some kind of code that could compromise a system, and your app would thereby be sort of complicit in this security violation of a user. So the fact is, these being Apple approved also sort of implies that they are designed for security and stability, and they in fact are. That leads to a lot of their limitations, but it's actually a pretty good thing as a starting point. So to know that you can install these things and use them and not feel as though they have the ability to completely change what you ship to customers. And then finally, I think it's a good sign just to see Apple doing anything on this front. And there's cause for optimism. You remember the first iPhone didn't even have copy and paste. It was miserably slow. It had a terrible camera. When Apple gets excited about something, they do iterate on it, we do see continuous improvements year after year, and I hope that that's indication here that that this is the tip of the iceberg for extending Xcode. So I want to talk a little bit about what they can do. I said already they're limited to the source editor, and you might think, okay, well that's it. That's all they can do. They can manipulate text. And I tried to put myself in a mindset to imagine more about what they might do. It's true they're limited to the source editor, but the way they're implemented, they're actually an independent process. This is part of the security model of app extensions. They're an independent process that has its own set of sandboxing privileges. And so you can essentially have this extension work on your behalf inside of Xcode, doing a lot of different things that aren't necessarily literally the process of changing text. So of course they can change text. Things that you might not have thought about is they can also access the web. So you could take some text in a document and send it out to a web service, have it be transformed, and come back and then substitute the text. You can also access NS Workspace on the Mac, which if you're not a Mac developer, it's like UI Workspace. You can do things like open URLs with it. And so you can have an action in an Xcode editor trigger maybe a context-specific opening of a web URL, maybe jump to a GitHub page, maybe go to a reference for the source, pertinent to the source that you're editing. And you can also display rudimentary UI. This thing has access to the whole Cocoa framework, so if you want to implement an extension that does something useful, but you don't want to change the source that the user is using, let's say you had some kind of statistics panel you wanted to put up. You could put that together in an extension and then display a Cocoa panel that conveys information to the user. And then finally, sort of the payback, the compromise of having to use an app to deliver these things means you also get to have an app on the user's Mac. So if you can think of things that make more sense in an app, the sort of like canonical thing is to have configuration preferences for your extension in an app. And those would be communicated to the extension probably through a shared preference file. Apple recommends that you use Darwin notifications to communicate between the extension and the host app. But apart from that, you could then have them share stuff either through shared files or through shared memory. And then the bad news, again, I already mentioned things like, well, Alcatraz is gone. But anything you have, any dreams you have of using an Xcode extension to, say, like rework the structure of a project. I might like to have an extension that said, I pointed a folder in my source tree and it says, like, alphabetize all these files for me, or something like that. And that's not possible with this mechanism. And also, anything that we sort of appreciate about Xcode, knowing so much about our source code, it has like its entire, semantic tree of our sources in our project. It would be cool to be able to access that, but we can't access that directly through this extension model. And finally, sort of part of the security limitations, the only way that your extension will be invoked is by direct user action. So essentially, when you make an extension, you define commands that then show up in the editor menu of Xcode. The user has to select those for your code to run. And the only sort of concession to convenience that Apple provides is that users can, of course, use Xcode's built-in custom keyboard shortcuts to assign a keyboard shortcut to your extension command. No source code, see? Isn't that nice? Build and run. So when I look at a new technology like this, I usually think, that looks like it could be cool. I know nothing about it. I should probably build something and try it out. And then I go down this kind of unfortunately error-prone road of trying to figure out how to make the first project. If you can't find like a sample project out there that happens to be a good skeleton for it, then in my experience anyway, I waste a lot of the enthusiasm I have trying to just get something working. And I would like to walk you through the process of making your own new source editor extension from scratch. It will be very painless. I'm kind of trying to show how it is painless, but you just have to know the right steps. So as an overview, to remind you, they're built on app extensions. So if you've done anything with app extensions on iOS or Mac, it's the same kind of process. That means you use Xcode to build an app extension which gets bundled in a host app. So you always start with a host app when you're working with app extensions. And the sort of working model for how you debug and build these things is you have a scheme in Xcode which is for your extension, and when you build and run that extension, it asks you, it prompts you, which app do you want to run it against? So for example, with share extensions, it makes a lot of sense. You choose an app like that, you want to invoke it, you want to run the app in order to use your share extension. And Xcode, they've adopted the same model, so you basically have to choose Xcode even though there's no other sensible choice for what you would debug against. So the overview of what we're going to do is, again, we're going to create a new Mac application. If you set out to make a new Xcode source editor extension, you will not find anything in Xcode's project templates to help you, because making a new project for this is not something that you can do. You make a new Mac application first, then you have to add a new extension target. And then finally, when you have both of those targets set up, you can build and run the extension scheme and select Xcode, and you'll be in business debugging your extension. So we'll walk through it with visuals here, just to make it painfully obvious. This is the new project template. You're probably familiar with this, except for yours probably doesn't have a red sweater application template item. You select Cocoa application. Name your app whatever you like. I chose Xcode Extender. That's the app that's going to have to live on the user's Mac somewhere, but it doesn't have to do anything to possess this extension. And then you look in the targets list, and you'll find at the bottom there's a plus button there. That's how you add new targets to an existing project. And in this case, when we click that, another template browser comes up, which has just what we were looking for, the Xcode source editor extension. Name that one. I just called it My Extension. And then Xcode will prompt you to activate the scheme that it's automatically creating for you. And this is a good idea because it will set you up to be ready to build and run your source editor extension and have it actually work. So now we have 2 targets in Xcode on our project. This was pretty fast. Once you know what to do, you're at this point in about a minute or so. And when you build and run, it'll prompt you, as I said, to choose an app. All of the ones except for Xcode don't make sense. So we pick Xcode, run. You might wonder why it wasn't the default, because there's no other. I guess somebody out there take it as maybe the competitors to Xcode can put together support for plugins. And then this is weird. This gloriously desaturated Xcode icon indicates that you are running a second copy of Xcode, which is tailor-made to distinguish itself from the main copy. So you run this to debug your source editor extension. And here I am. After having done this, I go to any source file, and if you're in a source file that's suitable to extensions, in the editor menu you'll find the name of the extension, My Extension, and then any commands which it implements underneath. This is the default you get when you just build from their template. But of course, it's pretty easy to change it after you get the setup. And if I run that right now, it won't do anything, but you could, at this point, set a breakpoint in the main version of Xcode and then be stuck there at the point where it's calling you to invoke whatever functionality it is you do. So if you decide to take my encouragement and get started with this, I want to give you some advice that will hopefully speed you up through the pitfalls you may run into. If you're on 10.11, you have to go through some other steps, I believe, still. You can look in the developer release notes from Apple. They have a special kind of line item in there for 10.11 users of Xcode 8. You do need Xcode 8 for this for a start, but then on top of that, if you're using 10.11 still and not on the betas of Sierra, then you'll need to do some extra steps. You have to sign your app and extension. If you just build, I actually left that out of the last of the visuals because this is a pretty recent change as of developer preview or developer beta 6 of Xcode 8. The IDE will not load any plugins if they're not signed, if both the app, I think, and the extension are not signed. So unfortunately, the way it shows that it's not signed is it just doesn't show up. And there's no console log error, there's nothing. So take it from me, sign your app and your extension. And then these are basically like all reasons that your extension won't show up in that little menu I showed you. Sometimes, and I think they've improved this in recent betas, but sometimes it just wouldn't show up because the system didn't notice that your extension existed yet. And I found that running the host app scheme from Xcode manually, so you actually run your app, which as you notice we didn't actually do, that sort of activates something in the system that says, oh, let's see if this thing has extensions. And I saw something in a release note about maybe improving that, but I have still run into problems where, for example, if I change something about the extension in the info plist, it won't get updated sometimes until I run the host app. And then finally, Xcode doesn't slow anything down to load these extensions. So if you run Xcode and you're excited to try your extension, and you jump to the editor menu and there's nothing there, it may be that you've done everything right and it just hasn't finished loading extensions. So wait a couple seconds and click the menu again and see if your stuff shows up. I guess you could have called those hot tips, but those were caveats. They're much different from hot tips. Caveats are things you have to understand because otherwise you just might not even be able to proceed. At least that's how I see it. These hot tips are things that are going to make you faster, and it'll feel less tedious, and you'll feel more productive developing and debugging these things. First thing you should do is select Xcode as the default debug target, so you never ever again have to run and then select Xcode from that stupid app list, right? And you do this from the scheme editor. If you look in the scheme editor under the Run tab, there's a executable ask on launch is the default. And this is where I think they probably should have made the default Xcode. But we can fix it. We'll just fix it once, and then we'll never think about it again. And another thing is I noticed when I was building and trying to test my extensions, I'd have to go through this laborious process of okay, do I have a project open? Do I now find a source file in here, click into it? Okay, now test my extension. And something that's maybe not obvious is many apps on the Mac, you can pass a full path to it when you invoke it, literally as if from the command line, and it will open that file. And Xcode is no exception, so if you go to the Arguments tab in the scheme editor for the extension, you can actually add a full path, and I recommend making a canonical source file that sort of exhibits all the features you want to test your extension against. Kind of obvious. Give it a keyboard shortcut. Like I said, you have to do this through Xcode's own preferences UI, but once you get into the groove of build, run, test, debug, you're going to want to be able to invoke your shortcut as quickly as possible. And you can do that from Xcode's preferences. You can actually change the keyboard shortcut for everything, almost everything, if not everything, in a menu in Xcode. That's kind of handy to know. And there's a lot of commands in there, by the way, that don't even have menu items. So look in there. If you're ever wondering, wouldn't it be cool if there was keyboard shortcut for selecting the previous line, but only the first word and the third word? It might be in there because there's all these things in there that historically have been part of Xcode way back to Next days, and they leave the command in there often, even if it's been taken out of the UI. And then finally, something cool I noticed was Xcode. Apple has actually started embracing these within Xcode itself. So I'm inspired now to keep my eye on Xcode's internal plugins folder, because some of the stuff that's in there, they have XC plugin bundle type. Some of them have changed to .appx for app extension. And so the ones I've noticed are kind of simple stuff, like the command to comment and uncomment text in the IDE is now implemented as one of these extensions. So I'm going to keep my eye and see if Apple adds any more. And then also, it sort of serves as a model for what is possible. If you see, well, they could always be cheating, but if you see something they're doing, for example, one thing they're clearly cheating on is that their menu items show up wherever they want them to, and yours will only show up at the bottom of that editor menu. So finally, I guess the point of this talk was to implore you to think about source editor extensions, think about whether you have any clever ideas. They are fairly disappointing in their scope and what you can do with them, but I think Apple developers, of all developers in the world, are the ones who can do amazing things with kind of a lot of constraints, right? The iPhone is an example of that. So if anybody can come up with clever ways to make Xcode source editor extensions miraculously helpful, I think it's this crowd. And the source code, which I mercifully left out of this presentation, is all pretty simple. It's stuff I basically developed while I was playing around with this, but some of the canonical examples for things that you might think, oh yeah, I would like to put a panel up, or I would like to open a URL on the website, on the browser. Or kind of a cool one I put together pretty recently was inserting placeholders into the text, the same way that Apple's own kind of like completion stuff works. You can put placeholders into your text that you put in. It's just a kind of a special text format that does that. So that serves, that GitHub project will sort of serve as an example of some of the ideas I had to try to think outside the box with these source editor extensions, and maybe you'll get inspired by some of that. So to close up here, I do believe we are often only as good as our tools, and the good news, though, is that by working as a community, we help each other. Carthage, CocoaPods, great examples. Taylor Swift, another great example of us all coming together and helping each other to do better work. So I hope that this will get you thinking about this new technology that's available to all of us, and check out my GitHub stuff. Get your own brain working on what you think is possible or not, and hopefully share some great tools to help us do better work. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you, Natasha, for inviting me to speak here, and I hope you all enjoy New York and the rest of the show. You can get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm DanielPunkAss, and my site is red-sweater.com. Thank you very much.